Thornton exclaimed. "Egad, sir, but you surely do not think this deed was committed by any one of the inmates of this house?" "As I have already said," replied Mr. Whitney, "I am not prepared to state what I do think without further knowledge of the facts in the case." "Of course we understand that," rejoined Mr. Mainwaring, "but we desire to have the benefit of your opinions and judgment regarding this case, so soon as you do feel justified in expressing them, and since you are vastly more familiar with the circumstances surrounding it than we wish to rely on your suggestions in this matter." The attorney bowed. "My advice for the present would be to take care that no one leaves the premises, and that you also send for Mrs. LaGrange. I wish to see her," he said briefly, and passed into the library. Ralph Mainwaring beckoned to the butler, who was standing at a little distance, awaiting orders. "Call the housekeeper at once. Mr. Whitney wishes to see her in the library. And send Wilson to me, and also the coachman." With a silent acknowledgment of the order, the butler withdrew, and a moment later John Wilson, a middle-aged man and a servant of Ralph Mainwaring's, who had accompanied him from London, appeared, followed by Brown, the coachman at Fair Oaks. Mr. Mainwaring first addressed the latter. "Brown, for the next hour or so I wish you to be stationed in the hall below. Keep back the crowd as much as possible. When the coroner and physician arrive, show them up at once, but on no account allow any one else to come upstairs." Then turning to his own serving man as Brown departed to the duties assigned him, Mr. Mainwaring continued, "For you, Wilson, I have a task which I cannot entrust to any one else, but which I know you will perform faithfully and discreetly. So far as you are able, keep a close watch upon every one within this house, without seeming to do so. Pay close attention to all conversation which you hear, and if you hear or see anything unusual, or that seems to have any bearing on what has happened, report to me at once. Above all, do not let any of the servants leave the premises without they have my permission." "Very well, sir," Wilson replied. As he moved away, the butler reappeared. "The housekeeper has not yet left her room, sir," he said, addressing Mr. Mainwaring. "I gave the message by the chambermaid, and she sent word that she had been prostrated by the terrible news this morning, sir, but that she would see Mr. Whitney in a few moments." As the man retreated, Mr. Thornton paused suddenly in his walk up and down the corridor. "'Pon my soul, Mainwaring, it strikes me, particularly since hearing that will read yesterday, that there must have been something with reference to that woman, well, rather peculiar, don't you know?" "It strikes me," replied Mr. Mainwaring, with marked emphasis, "that there may be something rather peculiar, as you call it, in that direction at present, and I believe Mr. Whitney is of the same opinion." "How is that? You surely do not think it possible that in his mind she is in any way associated with this murder, if it is a murder?" "He evidently suspects some one in this house, and for the present we can draw our own inferences. Regarding those provisions in the will to which you just now alluded, I can assure you I was not too well pleased, but I knew it was useless to raise any objections or questions. To my mind, however, they furnish a clue as to the possible claimants against the estate, which we were discussing yesterday, and perhaps a clue to this latest development also." "By my soul, it looks like it, but surely she could have no valid claim." "Valid or not," replied Ralph Mainwaring, "there must have been a powerful claim of some kind. When a man of Hugh Mainwaring's type leaves a handsome annuity to his housekeeper and an interest in his business worth $50,000 or $75,000 to her son, it may be considered pretty strong evidence that—" At a warning glance from Mr. Thornton, Ralph Mainwaring paused abruptly, and turning, saw Mrs. LaGrange coming noiselessly down the corridor. She was dressed with even more than usual care, with quantities of rich lace fastened loosely about her shapely neck, and falling in profusion over her beautifully molded wrists and hands. Her dark, handsome features bore no trace of recent prostration, but betrayed, instead, signs of intense excitement. She bowed silently and passed onward, entering the library so quietly that the attorney, absorbed in thought, was unaware of her presence until she stood before him. He started slightly, and for an instant neither spoke. Each was silently gauging the power of the other. For some time Mrs. LaGrange had been conscious that Mr. Whitney was one of the few whose penetration could not be blinded by her blandishments. In addition, the fact that he was the private solicitor and legal adviser of Hugh Mainwaring did not tend to inspire her with confidence regarding his attitude towards herself. Nevertheless, he was an eminent attorney, and this was a critical moment. If she could gain his favor and his services in her behalf, it would be a brilliant stroke of policy. Her plans were well laid, and she was prepared to assume whatever role was necessary, so soon as his words or manner should give her the desired cue. For this she did not have long to wait. One searching glance, and she had read in the piercing scrutiny and cold scorn of his keen blue eyes that, so far from winning favor from him, he would prove her most bitter opponent, and as quickly she determined upon her future course of action. Mr. Whitney, on the other hand, though a frequent visitor at Fair Oaks and familiar with the fascinating manner with which, when she chose, Mrs. LaGrange entertained the guests of Hugh Mainwaring, was now forced to acknowledge to himself that never had he seen this handsome woman so beautiful as at the present moment. The eyes looking into his with such depth of meaning, the expression, the attitude, all were utterly unlike anything which he had ever seen. But his face grew only the more stern, for the thought then and there occurred to him that perhaps here was the solution of the mysterious power which this woman had wielded over the man whose lifeless form was now lying in their presence. He observed that the luminous eyes grew suddenly cold, while her head assumed its usual haughty poise. The brief spell was over, and each understood the other. After a few general directions, Mr. Whitney remarked, "This day's events will be far different from what we had anticipated." "Yes," she replied, with a mocking smile, "in that it brings to the guests of this house, instead of future expectations, the immediate realization of their wishes." "It is not to be conceived for one moment that any of them take that view of what has occurred," he replied, in a tone of displeasure. "Possibly not," she rejoined, "although the prospective long life of their host seemed to greatly detract, at least in the case of one of their number, from their enjoyment of the occasion which they had come to celebrate." "To whom do you refer?" he inquired. "It is unnecessary to give names," she answered coldly, "but had the Mainwarings of London known the facts which I know, they would never have crossed the water to take part in the farce which was enacted here yesterday. There are Mainwarings with better right and title to this estate than they, as they will soon learn." Neither by look nor gesture did she manifest the least consciousness of or concern for the inanimate form visible in the adjoining room. With sudden directness, and ignoring the implied threat in her last words, Mr. Whitney asked, "Mrs. LaGrange, at what hour did you last see Hugh Mainwaring?" She was about to reply when Scott entered from the tower room. He had heard her last remark, and his dark piercing eyes were fixed upon her face in keen scrutiny. She was quick to note the fact and hesitated an instant, while a change, inexplicable to the attorney, passed over her face. Surprise, a shade almost of fear, and haughty defiance were visible in quick succession. Then turning again towards Mr. Whitney, she answered indifferently, "It was quite late last night. I do not recollect the hour." As the attorney was about to speak, Mr. Thornton appeared at the door of the library. "Beg pardon, Mr. Whitney, but I believe the coroner and others have arrived. As you know the gentlemen, would you kindly meet them?" "Certainly. Mr. Scott, you will please remain here." And the attorney hastened out into the corridor. Again Mrs. LaGrange and the secretary faced each other in silence, each apparently trying to read the other's thoughts and probe the depth of the other's knowledge. Then, as the gentlemen were heard approaching, she withdrew, leaving him alone. Chapter 5